So in this video, we are going to now look at what is probability and sample space diagrams. So the first thing we need to know is how do we actually work out the probability of something happening. So when it comes to actually working it out, we have to know how many outcomes there are in that situation. So the first thing we need to know is the fraction. So if you want to work out the probability, you do the number of successful outcomes over the total number of possible outcomes. And that will give us the probability of something happening. So for example, let's say that we had this spinner. We can see that we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's being cut evenly into quarters, and there's 4 outcomes that is possible. So let's say we had the following questions. So if we spin the spinner that is numbered on the side, what is the probability that it lands on a 2? So based on this fraction at the top, we can see that 2 appears once, and there's 4 outcomes in total. So we would say the probability is going to be, so the probability of getting a 2 is 1 out of 4, which is a quarter, which is 0.25. So then B, what's the probability of getting a 1? Well, again, if you look on the spinner, we only see the 1 once, and there's 4 outcomes in total. So we say 1 over 4. The second one says an odd number. So if we look on the spinner, we can see the odd number. We have 1 and we have 3. So there's 2 possible numbers that we can get. So the total of successful outcomes, so the probability of an odd number, this time is 2 outcomes out of 4, which we can simplify to a half. So it's an even chance, 50%, 0.5. And then the last one, a number greater than 1, well, we have 2, 3, and 4. So the probability of having a number that is greater than 1 is going to be 3 possible numbers out of 4, which is 0.75 or 75%. It's very likely to happen. So that is how you work out probability. It's the number of successful outcomes over the total number of possible outcomes. So, seems pretty easy, but what happens if we have 2 events? Okay, so let's move on to the next question. So let's say we have 2 fair coins at the side, and they are flipped at the same time. So we have tails and we have heads that would possibly on the coin. Let's say this is coin 1 and this is coin 2. The first question, write a list of all the possible outcomes. Okay, so I'm going to write them underneath. So let's say we have coin 1 and we have coin 2. So I could first get tails and heads. I could get the first one could land on tails and the second one could land on tails. That's all the outcomes we can have if tails is first, but what about if it lands on heads? The first one could land on heads and the second one could land on tails, and then the last one, they could both land on heads. So if you look, we have 1 possible outcome, 2 possible outcomes, 3 possible outcomes, 4 possible outcomes in total. They're the different combinations. Which question B says how many outcomes can we have? Well, there's 4 different outcomes. And then question C, what's the probability that we get 2 heads? So if you look down your combinations, it only appears once. So it only appears once out of the 4 different combinations. So the probability is a quarter. And then question D says, what's the probability of getting tails and heads? Again, if we look down all our outcomes, we have tails and heads at the top, so that's 1. And then if we carry on going, we have heads and tails on the third one. So that actually has a probability of 2 outcomes, successful outcomes, out of 4 total outcomes, which is a half, which is a 50% chance of that happening. So that's what we do when we have combined events, okay? But that was nice and easy because there was only 2 possible outcomes on coin 1 and coin 2. So what happens if we have more outcomes? How can we display this data? This is where sample space diagrams come into it. Okay, so a sample space diagram displays all the possible outcomes of 2 events, and we usually use this when we have more than 2 events per out. So for example, the coins, they only had 2 each. But what happens when we have more? Okay, so we have a red and a blue spinner. So Jodie spins a first six-sided and a four-sided spinner, and she adds the scores together. We're going to do a sample space diagram to show all the outcomes possible. So a sample space diagram makes it super easy and it's super clear. You can see all the outcomes we could possibly get. So if I take the sample space diagram, it's going to look something like this. So at the top, we're going to put the red spinner, and down the sides will be the blue spinner. And all we have to do is write what the outcomes could be. So 1 add 1 is 2. 1 add 2 is 3. 1 add 3 is 4. 1 add 4 is 5, and so on. And you can just fill in that sample space diagram, and this lists all the outcomes possible. So 2 add 1 is 3, 3 add 1 is 4, 4 add 1 is 5, and you can fill the whole diagram in. If we do that, we would be left with this sample space diagram. So then you can see that we can get 2s, we can get 6s, we have 8s, but let's ask some questions now using this sample space diagram. Okay, so let's find the probability of getting a total of 2. So the first thing we need to know is how many possible outcomes can we have? So that would be all the numbers that you see in the black. So we have 6 and 4, so that means in the black here, 6 times 4, there's 24 outcomes. So if you counted all them numbers, we would have 24 numbers in front of us. Okay, so that's the total number of outcomes. So the probability of getting a 2, we can see here, there's only 1 2 in the diagram. So the probability of getting a 2 is going to be 1 out of 24. So it's very, very low. It's a very slim chance, but there's still a possibility. What about the next question? What's the probability of getting a total of 6? If we look on our sample space diagram, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 possible chances. So this time, this one's going to be 4 out of 24. And we can simplify that by dividing both of them by 4, and we'll have 1 over 6. So it's a greater chance than getting a 2. It's 1 out of 6, which is 4 out of 24. Right, let's have a look at a prime number. Okay, so let me just get rid of these. So what is the probability if we spin both of these spinners, we will get a prime number? So let's circle our prime numbers. So we have a 2, we have 3s, we have 5s, and we have 7. And we just count how many prime numbers we have. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So the probability is going to be 11 over 24. That's the probability of getting a prime number. If you don't know what a prime number is, it only has 2 factors, itself and 1. Okay, let's have a look at the last question then. What is the probability that we get a number that is greater than 8? So we look at our sample space diagram. The only numbers that are greater than 8 is 9 and 10. There's only 3 possible outcomes, so we say 3 out of 24, which again we could simplify by dividing both by 3, which is 1 over 8. And that's how you work out the probability from a sample space diagram. You list all the possible outcomes that you can have, and you do the number of successful outcomes divided by the total number of outcomes.